Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. Michael Noland here, and tonight I think I've got a pretty good video for you. Tonight I'm going to give my thoughts and my review of Led Zeppelin's very first album, Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin has landed. You know, in the past video where I reviewed Led Zeppelin's albums and gave them a ranking, if you recall, I ranked this album very high. You know, with the delivery of this album, and especially this album cover artwork, you almost knew you were in for something slightly different. Now, the album artwork is fantastic. It's iconic. I love it. One of these days we'll discuss album artwork in general, but in my opinion, this is one of the most iconic covers for a rock album ever. Now, I do have a correction to my video on my top favorite rock guitarists of all times and the solos that prove my point. When I got to Jimmy Page, I errantly named the song that I was trying to describe as Communication Breakdown. The song that I was actually describing was the very first track off this wonderful album. And that, of course, is Good Times, Bad Times. And right away, we know this band is going to offer us something just slightly different. Opening the album with that bam bam, oh my goodness, I knew I was in for a treat. And this is the song and the solo that I was so impressed with that I talked about in my previous video, by the way. You know, back in the day, a friend tried to teach me this solo, and while the lesson was educational, I soon realized I wasn't going to be the next hot guitarist on the market. But it's not just Jimmy's technique, which is very impressive, by the way. It's the tones that he chooses for his guitars on this album that's very impressive, and the tone he uses here separates him from the band and makes its point right there, right then, on the very first cut. Now, it's on the next track. I do want to say something about Robert Plant's vocals here. On the recording, you can hear every lip smack, every gulp, every inhale of his voice. Now, with other bands later on, this is one of the very first things with a higher production value that they would mix out of a lead vocalist, and I think this is a mistake. When you listen to this tune, it's very intimate, isn't it? And how can it not be when you can hear him smack his lips in between each and every well-chosen line? Now, isn't it interesting here? Listen to the dynamics of this song. It actually develops, if you think about it, much like what they would do later on with the song Stairway to Heaven. It starts off, of course, as a ballad. It develops into a heavier production ballad, with the band finally culminating in this heavy, hard rock fashion. Second song, first album, and we have hints of greatness to come. Next up, of course, is the song You Shook Me. Now, for the last couple of weeks, I have been listening to this album, knowing I'd be putting out this video. And in re-listening to these songs, after not listening to the album for quite a while, I've got to tell you, I've heard things that I didn't quite hear before. And with this song, that's no exception here. I couldn't help but being impressed with the very drunken beat that this song is sung to. From the singer's point of view, something has happened with his relationship that has shaken him to the ground. But as the band's music indicates, this isn't a man who's taken it like a true champ. No, this is a man who is probably staggering out of a bar that he should have left hours ago. And within this same song, it's a good thing Led Zeppelin had their secret weapon. And of course, if you've seen any of my videos, you know that I think Led Zeppelin's secret weapon was John Paul Jones. And in this song, he does not disappoint, I can tell you. Here he supplies some of the most drunken smokehouse organ riffs I've heard in my life. And Robert Plant's voice is absolutely amazing on this song, especially when you consider he plays some mean-ass harp and can even manage a response to the harp's note with his voice. I know, not a brand new trick, but he did it so damn well. Now it's interesting, Robert Plant later commented that out of probably the whole band, he was the one that was the most self-conscious. Actually, he had mentioned that both him and John Bonham were very self-conscious. You have to understand, they were still on the Rube circuit. They were in bands that were still trying to get their first big break. They were professional. They were good. They had something to say, but they just weren't on the level that, say, Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones was. Don't forget, Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones was half of what I would call Britain's answer to America's Wrecking Crew. Now, I want to do a video on the Wrecking Crew here upcoming, but if you're not familiar with the term Wrecking Crew, it refers to a group of up-and-coming studio musicians that were willing to break the rules, sound fresh, and they were the ones who were doing most of the session work for very big acts in the LA area. Brian Wilson used them all the time, but he wasn't the only one. Meanwhile, back in England, Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones, along with another guitar player and a drummer, were playing on sessions that resulted in them being on more records in England than even the Beatles were at that time. Now, with Robert Plant and John Bonham feeling a little uneasy, who would find it easier to find an ease? That, of course, would have been John Bonham, right? I mean, he could take his frustrations out and work it out in the studio. Robert Plant would have to step back while these guys would get into a groove. And if you listen real carefully to this album, you can hear moments of hesitation on his part, but mostly you hear him breaking through that hesitation. Not only breaking through it, singing boldly, but traveling new grounds that no other singer had before him. And in the song You Shook Me, the whole band plays like the central nervous system shaken to the ground after a horrible breakup. Wonderful, and only 3 tracks in. Okay, next up, Dazed and Confused. What can I say about this song? In this song, we hear a fully realized Robert Plant. But it's not just that. There's more of him and Jimmy interacting. Now, this is interesting. We already know to listen to the interactions between Jimmy and John Bonham in the band. We've also discussed how John Paul Jones was so great playing over that sound rather than him connecting directly to what John Bonham was playing. The interplay between his lead vocals and Jimmy's searing and well-matched, as far as tone goes, guitar just rips right to the center of your soul. And when he finally informs us that the soul of a woman was created below, the whole band takes us right to where that is, to hell itself, and it's here that the singer is in torment. The vocal interactions, the screaming of someone suffering, and flames, literally represented by Jimmy Page's riffing. Now, just when you think you've figured out this band, right, comes the song, Your Time Is Gonna Come. Now, this song starts off with a very haunting keyboard played by none other than John Paul Jones. Now, just the way they've got the organ mic'd here and some of the notes, this reminds me more of Bach than a rock band's piece of music. Now, to me, right away, what does this do? This puts the intro into the 18th century, but this is a brand new rock song of current times. Time, your time is gonna come. And by rooting that basic sound into an almost 18th century feel to a song sung to a 1970 fan base, gives the song a bit of a timeless feel to begin with. And since the song is talking about time, your time is gonna come, right away the listener knows great care has been taken into exactly how the instrumentation should go with this song, and that John Paul Jones, Jimmy Page, and company have given very careful attention to the detail on how this song should represent what is being sung. Now the beat of the song is a bit laid back, not too much, but despite that, there is still a real heavy sound to this song. And guess what? It's supplied for the most part by John Paul Jones organ. Jimmy Page plays an acoustic guitar in this song for the most part. Now later, by adding pedal steel guitar, a wonderful sound here, but an instrument traditionally reserved for country western, maybe bluegrass sometimes. To me, this is just like when George Harrison supplied sitar on John Lennon's Norwegian Wood. A wonderful little plus to the song. Now it's in the next cut that Led Zeppelin leaves us a clue. And with the piece Black Mountainside, we get exactly that. This was a message to the fans out there directly from Jimmy Page that he wasn't messing around and that he wasn't going to be pigeonholed, and neither would his new band. Now it's with the next track, Communication Breakdown, that we see kind of a subgenre within Led Zeppelin. And by that I mean you have Communication Breakdown, right? And you also have A Whole Lot of Love and later Immigrant Song. These three songs, in my head anyway, sound like a whole sub-style and a style that most bands would have spent an entire career exploring. But not so with Led Zeppelin, nor would they abandon this just to be different either. Now it's with the next track, I Can't Quit You Babe. Here we not only get more vocal explorations from Robert Plant as well as interplay with Jimmy Page, but this is an excellent song to remark on the sound of the drums and really the whole band, but specifically the drums on this album. And this is a perfect track to talk about them. Now, if you've watched any of my Beatle-related videos, you'll know that I'm a big fan of Jeff Emerick and some of the amazing miking techniques, and it was he that developed close miking techniques. By the time Led Zeppelin showed up in the studio to record their first album, it was now the rule of thumb to close mic, especially drums. Now, I haven't discussed Jimmy Page as a producer much yet, and we're not going to get into a heavy discussion about that in this video. But what I do want to mention is he really is truly one of the greatest producers in rock. Not only in rock, but in music history, in my opinion. And right away, he knew he wanted a new sound. So, with a careful choice of microphones and an even more careful placement of those microphones, they were able to pick up John Bonham's drums. Now, the reason they even attempted this was because of the way John Bonham tuned his drums. Now, the way he tuned his drums was very pleasant to the ear in the room, but the way that the microphones picked them up made his drums evidently sound horrible. Little did Jimmy Page and Glenn Johns know that their new technique would be the technique that many would follow for the next decade as far as miking drums. Now, the last song on the album is How Many More Times. Now, it's interesting they chose this as the last song on the album. Why they chose to end the album with this song is a bit of a curiosity, especially since this was the song that often introduced the band live when they toured as the New Yardbirds. You know, it's in this song we've got to just stop and pause and talk about Jimmy Page as a guitar player here. He utilizes everything but the kitchen sink, and you know what? I think the kitchen sink may have been thrown in there as well. You know, back in the day with the Yardbirds, Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck hung out quite a bit together, and they had a friend who was kind of a electronic wizard kind of guy. And of course, Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck were very familiar with the old trick of putting a razor blade to a speaker in a guitar amp, and that of course would cause the speaker to distort. Some guitarists were going to that point in order to get the distorted sound that they wanted. Jeff Beck could not believe this was the only way you could achieve this. Jimmy Page also chimed in saying, yeah, there's got to be a way to get around this. Now, fuzz boxes were out by that point, there was no doubt, but both guitar players didn't like the way that it had no presence. It was through their friend working on an established fuzz box and adding electronics that would really highlight the mids and even highs. And it's through devices like these that Jimmy Page would take full advantage of. And you know, people talk about Jimmy Page taking a violin bow to his guitar as nothing more than a gimmick. And as far as I'm concerned, people who think that can keep that to themselves and put it right where the sun don't shine. He actually got the idea from David McCallum's father, David McCallum, the actor who played Ilya Kuryakin on the TV show Man from U.N.C.L.E., and it was his father talking with Jimmy Page where he said he didn't understand why someone hadn't at least tried that. Well, them's was fighting words for Jimmy for sure, and you just don't throw that kind of challenge out to that man. Throughout this album, Jimmy shows us the arrival of a new kind of guitar player. Not unfamiliar, mind you. Eric Clapton had already gotten heavy with Cream. Jimi Hendrix had been out on the scene for a while. But even just a general listening to this album shows you this man was the wizard. And I swear to God, the man would quite literally weave spells with his guitar live.